Moby Dick, Middlemarch, The Complete Peanuts, 1969–70. All of these titles inevitably get mentioned whenever people are discussing the idea of the greatest novel of all times, but I don't believe that any novel is mentioned quite as frequently as War and Peace. Of course, the sheer idea of the greatest novel of all times is just silly. Literature is not a competition as much as a conversation, a back and forth between different stories and different points of view, which, even when they're in opposition to one another, they present different sides of a story, especially when they're in opposition to one another, are actually all intimately connected, in the same way as all of our stories and our actions and responsibilities are also deeply connected. Believing that a single story could be the greatest of them all is not just preposterous, it's morally questionable, although of course in this age of YouTubes and internets you have people ranking novels and drawing up these perverse top tens. Can you imagine the nerve? Now, keeping all of this in mind, I must say that after finishing War and Peace, a task which, by the way, I wanted to complete before turning 30, and I managed it. I turned 30 this August, and I finished War and Peace just a couple of weeks ahead of my birthday. After finishing it, I can definitely see why people might be tempted to ascribe this novel to this great title and great realm of the unreachable absolute pinnacle of Western literature. So in this video I'll try and explain the reasons why War and Peace might perhaps deserve the title of the greatest novel of all times, if such a thing existed. The first reason is the most obvious. It's really not even the first reason, it's reason zero, which is that War and Peace is the greatest novel of all times. Not as in great, meaning very good, just as in very big, large. Look at it. No, it's not the longest, and no, it's not the widest, but it is the most ambitious, most overreaching novel in its scope that I've ever encountered. It tries to recreate an entire world, an entire period in history, Russia, or at least Moscow and Petersburg at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And at the same time, it tries to recreate up to the most minute convolutions of their thoughts, the inner lives of an immense cast of characters. Other novels, by all means, can be equally ambitious, but they don't tend to be as sprawling. Moby Dick, for instance, is mostly concerned with two things: whales and the darkest and most obscure recesses of the human soul, especially when the human soul is motivated by obsession. Anna Karenina, Tolstoy's other great masterpiece, focuses on a smaller cast of characters and tries to go even deeper within their psyche. Both of these works are less chromatically extravagant than War and Peace. These novels, as I said, are equally ambitious, but they try to do one thing, or at least a handful of things, very well and focus thoroughly on those. War and Peace tries to do everything, and it stands unparalleled, at least among the books I've read, for the sheer scope of its world building. No other books try to do justice to such an undertaking. Except perhaps Against the Day, and the Napoleon novels by Elena Ferrante, if you consider them one big novel. And possibly Middlemarch. I really don't remember anything about Middlemarch. I remember liking it at the time, but what is it even about? What this immensity in scope means for you, watcher and reader, is that War and Peace is a must-read if you are a fan of other similarly ambitious pursuits that try to recreate a fictional world up to its finest details through sheer artistry. Final Fantasy and Elder Scrolls games, double and triple albums, model villages, all of these types of efforts have, in a way, their very source in War and Peace. The reason behind this attempted universality is not just void and meaningless ambition by any means. In fact, this ambitiousness is tied deeply to Tolstoy's concerns for history as a scholarly subject, for historiographical pursuit. Tolstoy has strong opinions on the pursuit and the study of history, and these opinions are complex, they are well informed, and boy does Tolstoy bang on about them. They are interspersed throughout the entire narrative in ways that, I must confess, are never really intrusive. Tolstoy usually reflects about history and about the nature of it, the nature of our pursuit of history at the beginning of the various sections of the novel, and these reflections may be elaborate and sometimes a bit opaque, but don't really come in the way of the story. And then he also talks about them in a final 100-page long second epilogue, which I must assume only ended because at one point his wife took his pen away from him and hid all the pencils in the house and told him, Leo, no. No. Enough. I'm going to do a great disservice to Tolstoy by condensing all of these complex and nuanced theories into a very simple definition. But in a nutshell, Tolstoy in War and Peace objects to a view of history which was still very popular at the time, that considers history as the product of the actions of a few great men. A view of history that inevitably ascribes immense importance to Napoleon as the man who, more than any other, shaped the early 19th century and the face of Europe for decades to come. Tolstoy, in fact, didn't believe at all in this view of history and believed that these great, supposedly great historical figures were just as much a product of their own time and their own circumstances as the soldiers they commanded or the people at home who had to obey to their rule. Tolstoy believed that all of these people, all of humanity, was shaped and influenced and created and motivated and moved by the forces around them, the forces of their specific point in history, of their specific moment, of the cultural life of their country, of the ever-evolving life of human communities. And this is an incredibly modern view on the subject. By all means, Tolstoy goes into much greater detail, especially in that second epilogue, about the implications of this view for philosophical matters, especially when it comes to the concept of free will. What role does it play in human life if history is this set of conditions that determines the actions of all of us, both the supposedly great among us and the humblest members of society. I won't go into that. Suffice it to say that War and Peace offers plenty of philosophical fodder to the readers who are more intellectually oriented, say. Now, if history is not just made by great men on the battlefield because of their military genius, but it's made and created by all women and men through their actions, through their conditions, through their inner lives, then it follows that to try and capture the nature and the meaning of history, we must search deep into the inner lives of these people, people from different economical and social and cultural backgrounds, to try and build a fuller picture of a certain historical time. And that's exactly what Tolstoy set out to do in War and Peace, and exactly why the novel is so ambitious, so sprawling, and mixes different settings, the battlefield and the salons of high society in Russia, and people from various different backgrounds. Some might object that the common people, such as, again, farmers, laborers, servants, play a very minor role in this novel, and that the novel doesn't quite capture the full spectrum of human experience, but tends to focus on a very privileged, very small sector of Russian society, which is definitely true, but hey, it's a good start, I would argue. And now, an impromptu top 5 of the worst characters from War and Peace. Natasha is nice enough, but she can sometimes be immensely spoiled and quite a brat. Rostov is an immense brat. Andrei Bolkonsky thinks he's so much better than anybody else, and that anybody else is a fool, and he's such a deep man with his intellectual life and his concerns. Dolokhov, violence is always wrong, but when you were reading War and Peace, weren't you wishing that one of the many bullets flying around Europe all the time will end its life inside Dolokhov? I sure was at times. And oh, the worst, the absolute ass is definitely Nikolai Bolkonsky. That man is a monster. I hated him so much. Now, I started drafting these top 5 worst characters in earnest, and it was supposed to be followed by a top 5 best characters from War and Peace. But I realized something funny when I was trying to do that, which is that many of these characters, definitely Natasha, and actually definitely Andrei Bolkonsky too, would also be in the top 5 best characters from the novel. This is because these people can be despicable and base and self-absorbed and self-concerned, but they can also be loving and caring, and they obviously care deeply for their friends and their family, and they're motivated by rather luminous reasons most of the time. And even Dolokhov, who's such a twat, loves his mom so much, doesn't he? This speaks very closely to what must be the real triumph of War and Peace, beyond its historical scope, beyond its ambitiousness, which is that its characters are portrayed with an incredible degree of truthfulness. The workings of their psyche are convincing and true to life. They are filled with sorrow and joy, with nastiness and beauty. They are motivated by the same irrational and extreme passions, and they are filled with the same doubts and concerns and uncertainties that motivate and fill all of us, really, as human beings. The reason why Tolstoy's characters are so incredibly complex and real and convincing is that he doesn't hold back at all when portraying them. He has the courage to portray even the supposed heroes of the novel as base, self-absorbed, lost in their own personal ambitions and greeds and lusts. Because that's an inevitable and it's an essential component of trying and capture their humanity and of showing their luminous sides too. You can describe the latter without talking about the former. Otherwise, you just wouldn't have a convincing human being. Definitely not such convincing characters are Tolstoy's. That's why it's impossible to rank Tolstoy's characters in a similar way as it's impossible to rank novels. These people, the Rostovs, the Dolokhovs in the novel, they are filled with selfishness, they can be brutal, they can be nasty to one another. But that's all part of their humanity, and it's inevitably intertwined with their character, the same reasons that made them good and loving. The great darkness at the heart of all of War and Peace's characters is what makes this book not just a really great novel, but one of the most important works of art, one of those rare, truly essential works of art that we should cherish as one of our greatest achievements as a species, because it shows in very clear terms the workings of our own inner lives, of our minds and our hearts and our emotions and feelings. It shows all of these things that are secluded from each other's sight, that we just can't experience if not through art. The introduction to my edition of War and Peace, which I think is written by Anthony Briggs, it's not clear in the text, says it very clearly. I'm quoting from it. The author talks about Russian writers, and he says that the Russian writers have seen life, tackled it, and tried their best. And they know a truth that rarely declares itself, especially in stories that are meant for entertainment. It is this: virtually everyone, even people in advantageous or privileged circumstances, finds the living of life a worrying and difficult business most of the time. That is a really valuable lesson that is very rarely taught, and is something that you should cherish as valuable in your times of happiness, and you should refer to in your times of sorrow and difficulty as a source of great consolation, in the way all the stories really, but especially such vivid and such clear stories as War and Peace, can nourish us and show us how our difficulties are shared by everybody else. Now, I've started blabbering on a little, so let's bring it back to earth. Is War and Peace flawless? No. The main flaw in War and Peace, I would say, is its portrait of Napoleon. Tolstoy clearly hated Napoleon's guts, and that's shown through the novel, in the way Napoleon is portrayed as this despicable, almost stereotypical villain who's just self-absorbed with his own greatness and has no concern for the immense suffering he is causing among his troops, among all the people of Europe. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that this portrait is not true to life. I'm just saying that the way Tolstoy portrays Napoleon is completely at odds with the great honesty that I just described, and that he uses with all his other characters. More generally speaking, especially in the last part of the novel, when it comes about Tolkien discussing the war between France and Russia, the novel sometimes slips toward the almost propagandistic. There is a very strong sense of Russian patriotism that shines through, and it once again is a bit at odds with the general honesty and great integrity and detachment of the text. This doesn't happen all the time, and sometimes Tolstoy is able to describe, for instance, the brutality of Russian soldiers or the basic humanity of French soldiers, who are not all monsters and raiders and thieves. But it is definitely a flaw, a dent in an otherwise truly impressive novel. These flaws are inevitable, though, in works of such ambitiousness, because they try to do so much. They cannot possibly do it all well. Elder Scrolls games are full of glitches, Against the Day loses track of itself sometime toward the end, and even model villages are rarely worth their entry ticket. Going back to the initial silly question, is War and Peace the greatest novel of all times? Yeah, man, why not? Whatever. Speaking of which, I absolutely recommend my edition of War and Peace. Anthony Briggs, the translator, makes a very compelling case of why, what his translation brings to the existing canon of English translations of the novel. It's quite a modern one. The word fuck appears twice toward the end. It's got a flawless apparatus of notes to contextualize some of the most obscure cultural references from early 19th century Russia. It includes a summary, a brief summary of all the chapters, in case you set the novel aside for a while and then want to come back and don't quite remember what was happening last time you were reading it. Although I recommend you don't do that. I recommend you read War and Peace when you can set aside a month or two to dedicate to it. It's gonna be an ambitious pursuit. It's just that kind of book. It's very engaging and very entertaining. It's by no means difficult, but it will require you to set aside a colossal amount of time. I just don't think it's worth it if you read it through a scattered approach and can't really keep the entirety of this fictional world created in your mind. I think it requires that type of commitment. What was I saying? The edition, the Penguin Clothbound Classics, and more broadly speaking, the Penguin Classics edition of the book is truly valuable, includes some interesting military maps from the Napoleonic Wars to understand the military aspect of the novel better. Truly valuable edition, and of course it looks stunning. I love Penguin Clothbound Classics. I think they are among the best book designs on the market. Speaking of book designs and book covers, one class that I recently took on Skillshare that I found really fascinating was an introduction to book cover designs, making stories visual, by Chip Kidd, a really amazing, interesting and funny teacher. It's an amazing class about the art of creating compelling book covers that effectively convey the nature of the story or the text, the artifact inside. Chip was a really passionate teacher, and this class was extremely informative, relaxed, and just plain cool. It's just one example of the many classes that are on offer on Skillshare, which is an amazing community of creatives and experts in a variety of fields, from design to writing, finance to gardening. The classes are split in videos, so you can take them in your own time and make them fit around your schedule. And they have a beautiful community vibe to them as you interact with your teachers and with the other students taking the class in a really supportive environment. I absolutely recommend you check Skillshare out. There is a link in the description box, and the first 1,000 people to click on it will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so they can start exploring their creativity right away. Thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you to my patrons for supporting the YouTube channel, and bye everybody.